Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual workshop, welcoming our new Afghan neighbors. I'm Tim Seatman, and I'm the founder of Keep Our Word. Keep Our Word seeks to encourage people to help threatened Afghans. We share their stories on our website at keepourword.org and on social media. And we also try to direct people toward ways they can help threatened Afghans, both through our website and through social media and through events like this. In our workshop today, we have two very special presenters who will help us learn how we can welcome our new Afghan neighbors. The first person will be Matt Sorens, who is the Director of Church Mobilization at World Relief, and also the author of the book, Welcoming the Stranger. We also have Christy Statz, who is a mobilizer with the Evangelical Immigration Table coming today. And after that, we'll also have time for you all to ask questions and Christy and Matt to answer. And before they begin, I'd like to share what motivated me to start Keep Our Word and host this workshop. All of you have seen news about the recent events in Afghanistan. And for myself and some of you here, what happened in Afghanistan was more personal because of our Afghan friend. I'll call him Jay. And he was in Afghanistan as the government began to collapse. And even though some of you know the story, some here do not. So I want to take a few minutes to talk through what happened to him. When Matt and Christy share later, I hope hearing Jay's experience now can help us keep in mind what Afghan refugees have been through. Like many Afghans just a few months ago, Jay was not thinking of leaving Afghanistan. He was living and working there. It was home. And then one day, Jay contacted myself and other friends, some of you here today. He asked for help leaving the country and seeking asylum in the US. Jay was receiving threats from the Taliban. This was because he had worked with foreigners a lot. Also, he belongs to an ethnic minority. We started researching how he could leave Afghanistan and seek asylum in the US. We quickly learned that this would not be easy, and this was even before the Taliban retook the country. Jay's passport had expired, so he couldn't get a visa right away to enter a different country. He rushed to get his documents ready. And during this time, the US military pullout began to speed up, and provincial capitals began to fall to the Taliban. In spite of all our research, we could find no way for Jay to travel any further than a nearby country like India or Pakistan, where he could apply for asylum at a US embassy. Then we learned that asylum seekers in many countries may wait many years before being approved to immigrate to the US. Even so, we kept investigating these options, but it was too late. Afghanistan fell to the Taliban. All commercial flights stopped. All foreign embassies closed. All the borders were shut. And the Taliban started to search for Jay in his neighborhood by name. Now, you should know that Jay is a person of strong faith. He did not give up hope. He often said to us that he knew there was a reason for all that was happening. Our work in assisting Jay now took a new turn. Jay hoped he could get on the US military evacuation flights leaving the Kabul airport every day. So we started contacting government officials to find out what to do. We slowly learned that the only way to get on an evacuation flight was to be sent a flight confirmation number proving you had a seat on a flight, and then to go and show your documents to the soldiers at the airport gates. And the only way to get such a confirmation number was for someone at the US State Department to put your name on a flight manifest. We continued calling, writing, and asking for Jay to be put on such a list. But time was running out. The US government said all evacuation flights would stop on August 31st, now just a few days away. Jay was in hiding. He moved from place to place, staying away from his family and their home where the Taliban were searching for him. Whenever he traveled any distance in the city, there was a chance he would need to pass through Taliban checkpoints. But he also needed to keep his paperwork with him at all times, paperwork that identified him as someone who had worked with foreign NGOs. Day after day, we waited and we prayed for Jay to receive a number. Then one day it came. Jay was given a confirmation number and he headed for the airport. Outside the airport, Jay spent more than 50 hours waiting in long lines. The crowds were packed tight and hardly moving. Many who went to the airport simply gave up. There was little water or food there. Jay had to sleep on the ground outside in the open and wade through raw sewage as he waited. Finally, we received a message from Jay saying that he had made it inside the initial gate, but there were additional security checks inside. We knew he could still be turned away. For the next 12 hours, we frantically contacted every senator and congressperson we could. We asked them to push anyone they knew on the inside of the airport to get through the final checkpoint. 12 hours later, we heard the good news. Jay had made it all the way through the airport, or through the security checks. He was inside the secure area of the airport and waiting for a flight. We were so happy and thankful to God. Soon, he took off and flew to Kuwait. Just hours after he departed, a bomb exploded at the same gate where he had been waiting, killing and wounding hundreds. Eventually, Jay landed in the US and was taken to a base where a temporary refugee camp for thousands of Afghans had been quickly erected. In the camp, Jay learned that he had been given immigration parole for 2 years. This means he could stay in the US and apply for asylum. Soon, Jay will be flown here to be with my family. We will take care of him for a while as he starts his new life in the US. Sharing stories like these is part of Keep Our Word's mission. The other part is to encourage people like you to find ways to help threatened Afghans like Jay. But you may be like me, you don't know how you can do that in the best way, and you have certain capabilities and not others, and the Afghans themselves have certain needs and not others. You may be asking questions like, how can I get started? What organizations are already working with Afghans in my community? Are any Afghans coming to my area? What will they need? What if my church wants to support or sponsor whole families? You might also be asking bigger questions like, how do refugees and asylum seekers normally get to the US? Why should we welcome them here? Don't they want to go back home? Could they be dangerous to us? There's a lot to be said, and that's why we've asked Christy and Matt to take some time to share with us tonight. Matt is going to start by tackling the big picture first for 15 minutes, and then Christy will take on the practical issues second for 25 minutes. Matt and Christy both work with Christian organizations that serve refugees and immigrants. Many of you here are familiar with such organizations, and others might not be. If not so familiar, please be aware that both Matt and Christy will also share how people from a Christian faith background are uniquely motivated by the Bible to care for refugees like Jay. We hope that you enjoy hearing some things from that area. After Matt and Christy talk, we'll have 10 minutes for questions and answers. As you listen to Matt and Christy, please do put your questions into the Q&A in Zoom. To use that feature, just move your mouse down to the bottom of your Zoom program window and you'll see several buttons appear. Click the Q&A button to submit a question. Now I'll turn it over to Matt to start. Go ahead, Matt.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So you don't have to look at me in the weird purple background. I happen to be up visiting my parents right now, so I apologize for the strange look, but we'll get the PowerPoint here that hopefully will look a little bit better. As Tim said, my name is Matt Sorns. I work with a Christian organization called World Relief, which is the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals. World Relief has been involved in refugee resettlement since the 1970s. In fact, since the 1970s, we've resettled about 300,000 refugees to communities around the United States. And our mission at World Relief is not just to resettle refugees, it's to empower the local church to serve the vulnerable. So we are really particularly focused on how do we partner with local churches to welcome refugees, whether they're from Afghanistan or from anywhere else. As Tim has said, the situation for Afghans is a little bit unusual in that most of the people who are coming from Afghanistan have fled Afghanistan just in the last several weeks, not years ago, as is more often the case with refugees. Also, most of them are technically coming with a parole status as opposed to refugee status. That means very little in terms of their needs, but it may have some impacts on how they are treated by the U.S. government. Just in the big picture, the U.S. has already received about 50,000 Afghans who've been paroled in the U.S., most of whom are still on those military bases that Tim referenced, some of whom have already begun to be resettled to communities around the U.S. And World Relief expects to receive somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 of those individuals. So there are 9 agencies nationally And most individuals will be sent from one of those military bases through one of the resettlement agencies in local communities. And I'll talk at the end about how you find out what organizations are in your community. But I do want to speak specifically to those of us who are Christians, and my apologies if that's not everyone on the call, but as a Christian organization, I also think it's important, before we get to sort of the how of welcoming refugees, that we spend a little bit of time on the why. One thing that we found is that refugee resettlement is a very controversial issue, and that's true to some extent with Afghans. It's been true certainly over the last several years. In fact, I saw this poll last week that I found really interesting. We're actually up to about 7 in 10 support among evangelical Christians for resettling refugees from Afghanistan or similar countries, which I found encouraging, but also very interesting that had shifted from just a year ago, only 4 in 10. This was a particular poll that looked at white evangelicals. I'm sorry, and I misphrased the question there. Only 4 in 10 basically were supportive of refugee resettlement last year. So, and that all is rooted, I think, in the reality that our response as Christians to refugee resettlement is often based on what's in the news instead of on our faith. In fact, we did a separate poll a few years ago, found that only 12% of evangelical Christians said that their views on the arrival of refugees or other immigrants to their community was primarily influenced by the Bible. So what I want to do this evening is just spend a few minutes, and I'll turn it over to Chris to some more practical elements, looking at how the Bible ought to inform how we respond to issues of refugees, whether from Afghanistan or anywhere else. One is the reality that Jesus himself was a refugee. You can see that picture there is a nativity set. That's our nativity set. And a few years ago, my daughter Zipporah, it just became her favorite toy for the whole month of December, acting out the Christmas story. But she turned to me one day and said, "You know, Dad, our nativity set is missing someone. We don't have the angry king." Of course, I knew who she was talking about. I've read the Christmas story from the Jesus Storybook Bible enough to her that I was familiar with exactly who she was talking about. And I thought about that. And, King Herod is not in our nativity set. I suspect he's probably not in yours either. It's maybe not our favorite part of the Christmas story to have, after the Magi, the wise men bow down before Jesus, to then move on to the next part in Matthew chapter 2, where Joseph is warned in a dream that Herod, this paranoid king, is coming to kill all the little boys in Bethlehem. And Joseph is warned to take Jesus and Mary and escape across the border to Egypt, outside of Herod's domain, where they would be safe. And in that sense, Jesus was a refugee, or maybe an asylum seeker. Of course, they didn't have these formal legal definitions at the time, but under U.S. law today, a refugee is someone who's fled their country because of a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. There's 26.5 million people in that category globally, and that doesn't include another 45 million or so who have been displaced internally. So they've fled their homes, but are still within the boundaries of their country. It also doesn't include those who are classified as asylum seekers. So these are people who get to a particular country and basically profess to meet the definition of a refugee. They say they have a credible fear of persecution, but until such time as the government of whatever country has verified that claim, they're considered an asylum seeker as opposed to a refugee. Of course, I say that we don't know exactly which category Jesus fit into because we don't have a lot of details about how he was treated, if he interacted at all with the Egyptian government. But we do know that for those roughly 26.5 million people in our world today, and frankly, tens of millions others who fled persecution in other contexts, they have someone in Jesus who can very personally identify with that experience. I think that ought to be foundational for Christians as we think about how we would interact with someone who has been forced to flee their home because of persecution. Another biblical theme is that we believe as Christians that every person is made in the image of God, and that is not just refugees or immigrants, but it certainly includes refugees and immigrants. That, of course, gives us a motivation to want to protect human life when people are fleeing a situation of persecution or even potential threats on their life, because we believe that human life is invaluable, it has dignity, and is worth protecting. But then another dynamic of being made in the image of God is that it means that refugees, just like any other immigrants and just like all people, have potential because they're made in the image of a creator to create and to contribute. And I think that's important to know when we talk about refugees, because often the conversation moves very quickly to, well, what is this going to cost us? Or can we afford this as a country to welcome people who fled persecution? The reality is we make a mistake if we only count up the costs and forget to count up the contributions. That's not to say we shouldn't count the costs, and we can do so. We can ask how many jobs refugees will take, although I would note that at the moment there is a great need for labor in the United States. But we also need to ask the question of how many jobs refugees will create. And historically, refugees and other immigrants have created a great number of jobs. About 44% of the Fortune 500 companies were founded by some sort of an immigrant or their child, including those who are refugees. Or even just on a fiscal level, it's true that most refugees, if you look, 1 year after arrival, because in general, refugees receive some assistance from the U.S. government, and there's some costs involved in processing. Obviously, that evacuation costs a lot of money. In general, there are some costs, and if you look, let's say 1 year after arrival, the average refugee adult has usually received more from the American taxpayer than they have paid in. But if you look 20 years after arrival, the average refugee adult has actually contributed significantly more, about $21,000 more on average at all levels in taxes than they have received in terms of governmental assistance and the resettlement assistance they received up front. So that's not to say we I think would have a moral obligation to care for the people who are vulnerable, even if it weren't in our national economic interest. But it turns out it is, and it's rooted precisely in the reality that the individuals who are welcoming, just like the rest of us, are made in the image of God with potential to create and to contribute. Another really foundational biblical theme is that God is concerned for those who are vulnerable, and we see that throughout the scriptures. Often the three groups that are mentioned repeatedly are the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. In fact, that word for a foreigner in the Old Testament, the Hebrew, is the word ger. It appears 92 times just in the Old Testament. It's actually a really frequent theme. God says that he loves these people, and then he commands his people to love them as well. And then also in the Old Testament, but then continuing into the New Testament, God tells his people to love their neighbors as themselves. And if we would be tempted to narrowly define who our neighbor is, it makes it really clear in Luke chapter 10, when Jesus is asked about this great commandment to love your neighbor, he's asked, well, who is my neighbor? And he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, which makes it pretty clear that our neighbor could be someone of a different religious tradition or a different ethnicity who is in need, because that's exactly the example Jesus gave us in the story of the Good Samaritan. It's also worth noting that there's no caveat to that command. We're called to love our neighbor whether or not it's totally safe. The irony in our context in the United States is it is incredibly safe to welcome refugees and other immigrants, but refugees in particular go through an incredibly thorough vetting process. The Heritage Foundation and others have said that the vetting process that the U.S. government has for refugees who are admitted into the country is the most thorough the most thorough vetting that our country has for any category of visitor or immigrant who comes into the United States. Since the Refugee Act was passed into law in 1980, and that kind of set up the current infrastructure for refugee resettlement, there's been about 3 million refugees resettled to the United States, and not a single one of them has taken the life of an American citizen in a terrorist attack, which is a really remarkable record and a credit to our government. Now, some would say, okay, but the Afghans who are arriving, they haven't gone through the normal refugee process. Many of them are being paroled in, and less time. That's certainly true. Even though they are being paroled in and it's not taking quite as long, they're still going through the same security checks, the same biographic and biometric checks before being allowed into the United States. And then there's further processing, especially around health and vaccines and that sort of thing that's happening on those military bases. But I was on a call recently with Elizabeth Newman, she was the Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security for Counterterrorism under the previous administration. And she said she talked to some of her former colleagues at the Department of Homeland Security and was really comfortable with what they described in terms of the very thorough vetting that they're doing in terms of biographic and biometric security checks. So it's appropriate for us to ask the question, is the government doing their job in terms of vetting and security? But we also need to be asking the question that was asked of Jesus, who is my neighbor, and make sure that we're being a good neighbor and loving our neighbors as they arrive. One thing that's true of a lot of refugees and globally is that many of them are persecuted specifically for their faith in Christ. In fact, the number one country of refugee origin for refugees who resettled to the United States in the last decade, and this may change with the Afghan situation, but it has been Burma. And about 70% of those refugees are actually Christians, many of whom are persecuted specifically for their faith. In fact, over the last 10 years, the plurality of refugees resettled to the United States have been Christians of one sort or another, often who have been persecuted specifically because of their faith. When we welcome them, there's a sense in which we have the chance to welcome Jesus himself. In Matthew 25, Jesus says, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. And the disciples say, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or sick or in prison? And Jesus says, whatever you did for one of the least of these, my brothers, you did unto me. It's also worth noting that, and this goes to the advocacy point that we, as mentioned earlier in some individual cases, on a broad scale, when we advocate for refugees to be allowed in the United States, that has an important impact on persecuted Christians. And conversely, when refugee admissions go dramatically down, which has happened from 2017 down to really until this year, we've seen the number of persecuted Christians who were able to come to the United States declined really dramatically as well. So this is from a report with Open Doors USA from last year. The number of Christian refugees, specifically from the 50 countries on the Open Doors World Watch list for countries where Christians face persecution. Of course, Afghanistan's on that list, Burma, Iraq, Iran, Syria. It went down from about 18,000 down by about 90% by last year, and it has actually continued to decline. Now, some people would say, okay, there's Christians who come in persecuted. What about those who are not Christians? What about those who come from another faith background, those who are Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists? Some people will actually see that as a sort of a threat, as something to be afraid of. Our view at World Relief has long been this is actually a Great Commission opportunity for the church. You have people coming from countries where there's very little religious freedom, where they would be unlikely to encounter the gospel, and if they did, face incredible penalties for choosing to follow Jesus. And they come into our country where we are blessed with religious freedom, where we are free to share our faith and people are free to receive it or to reject it. And to be really clear, we don't push faith on anyone. We don't try to trick anyone into conversion. We don't pressure anyone in any way. We don't do proselytism at World Relief, but we do believe in evangelism rightly understood, which is just an open invitation, and people can choose for themselves how or if they want to worship. But very often, there's questions that happen when people are served well, when it's a team from a local church that welcomes a family at the airport. It's rare that sooner or later there's not the question of why, and we get to, as 1 Peter 3 says, to be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason, for the hope that is within you. It's worth noting with the situation with Afghanistan in particular, Afghanistan is the only nation in the world where less than 3% of the non-Christian population, which of course is the vast majority of the population in Afghanistan, less than 3% of the non-Christian population personally knows a Christian. So that's a pretty remarkable statistic. Not that they've never heard the gospel or been to a church, but they don't know a Christian. And yet so many of those individuals will be arriving in the United States, in a country where, of course, there are many Christians and where we have religious freedom. And yet you can't just presume that that's an automatic thing, because the same resource, the Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon-Conwell Seminary, finds that 60% of people of non-Christian religious traditions in North America also do not personally know a Christian. So that's a different percentage, but still the majority of non-Christian religious people in the United States or Canada do not personally know a Christian. And so we may say those people need to get out more, but I would contend that we need to do a better job of getting to know our neighbors, of loving them as ourselves, which we're called to do whether they would ever share our faith or not. And in doing so, we've seen people ask those questions and make the decision for themselves to follow Jesus. So I'm going to close this with really quickly a few ideas. This acronym is hopefully helpful. It's PLEASE. So the first point there is prayer. For those of us who are Christians, we ought to be praying without ceasing about any hard situation, especially for those who are still stuck in Afghanistan and in dangerous situations. The L is for listening to the stories of refugees themselves, and also listening to God's word. One tool I would recommend to you is we have something called the I Was a Stranger Challenge, which you can find at the Evangelical Immigration Table website. And Hannah, I don't know if you could plug that into the chat. That might be helpful, or we can share this after. But it's just a 40-verse Bible reading guide to ground our thinking in the Bible. Empowering churches abroad. The reality is most refugees in the world will never come to the United States. In fact, 85% of refugees globally are in a country neighboring the country that they fled to. And yet in all of those countries, to some extent or another, there's a local church, and often a very vibrant local church with very few resources, but doing all they can to care. And that's some of the work we do at World Relief. You can be part of that through our monthly giving community called The Path. The A in that acronym is advocacy. One of the most urgent, I'd say two urgent advocacy needs right now. One is for the people still stuck in Afghanistan. We continue to advocate for the U.S. government to approve more humanitarian parole cases, but also for those who have been paroled in, they will have the possibility of pursuing asylum, but that is an incredibly long and burdensome process. We would like for them to be able to just, go through another set of background checks and then apply for permanent legal status. And frankly, we'd like the same for some other groups of immigrants who've been in sort of indefinite temporary status for many years. So you can sign on to the letter that we have there at evangelicalimigrationtable.com/Afghans. And then serving locally. Again, most of these refugees will be coming through local affiliates of the 9 refugee resettlement agencies. One of those is World Relief. You can see where we're operating at worldrelief.org/US. And if you go to welcome.us, it's a larger coalition that World Relief is a part of, along with lots of other, all the other resettlement agencies and lots of other groups. You can find a way to get involved in your community if World Relief is in your community. And then evangelism, as we advocate with people, as we serve them, as we love them as our neighbors, we have those relationships and opportunity to point people to the gospel. Again, some people are already Christians, and others maybe have never even heard of Jesus before. So it's an opportunity for the church. With that, I will turn it over, I guess, back to you, Tim, or maybe directly to Christy. You can tell me who's next.
Christy, you go right ahead.
I believe we're going over to myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Christy Statz. I live in Stowe, Ohio, which is Northeast Ohio, and it is a privilege to be here today. I'm going to also share my screen and get started. My history has been a weaving, winding path. I lived overseas for a good number of years and had the opportunity myself to go and work at a girls' school for a month in Afghanistan a good number of years ago. And it was one of the greatest privileges of my life. Okay, I am not, where is that? Let's share the presentation. Hold on. Of course, there we go. There it is. I haven't done this in a few minutes. Okay. Actually, I'm going to do that right there. Let's do this. Hold on one second. There we go. Okay. There's always going to be one person to be slow on the technology. Of course, it's me. So I was able to get to spend some time with Afghans a number of years ago in the country, and they are some of the most hospitable people I have ever met. So one of the things that I'm so encouraged seeing so many of you here on the call is that we have the opportunity to show hospitality to them in the way that their culture is so hospitable. Is everybody seeing that type?
And it's just taking time. So maybe just go ahead without the slides. If they show up, I'll just bring them up.
So you guys will all get a copy of this, which will make it a lot easier. And so you'll get a visual of this later. And so the first thing you're going to do is a Google search. You will type in HHS plus refugee resettlement. And again, you don't have to write this down because this will be something that you will see in the future. But this will take you to a page. The very first link that will come up will be the Health and Human Services link for the country. And they have a fantastic map that has every organization that welcomes and resettles refugees around the country. If you click on the map that is on that front page of HHS, they are able to show you a list of every organization in your state. And so some of these organizations will be like Matt, who works for World Relief. Oh, wonderful, they've arrived, yay. We'll start right there. And so you go to HHS plus refugee resettlement, which is the previous slide. And then the very first link at the top of the Google search will be the Health and Human Services website for the United States. And so you scroll down that, and this will be the first opportunity that you can click on. You'll see this map on their front page. And so depending where you are in the country, you can click on your state. And then if we go to the next one, so I've clicked Ohio for us. And so this is a list of all of the organizations around Ohio that welcome and resettle refugees. So you could see there in Akron, Ohio, I mentioned the International Institute of Akron. So what you'll do is you'll click on one of those cities, and then those are the organizations that if an Afghan family is going to be sent to your area, they will come through one of those refugee resettlement organizations after they leave the military bases that they are currently on and being processed. Tim, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Man, I'm so glad you're able to jump in. I don't know why it stopped letting me share my screen, but this is wonderful. So you guys all saw a few weeks ago, as Kabul collapsed and the country collapsed over to the Taliban. This is a little bit of the process of what has happened. So we saw the evacuation from Kabul in stage 1 and 2 it was just quick and urgent. And so folks just got immediately taken out to military bases around the world. And there's a few of the countries listed there that had kind of first stop bases. And then folks like, we heard earlier, Tim's friend, had a first stop in one military base and then were brought to the US, where they've been the last month to 6 weeks, getting processed, getting vaccines, getting their biometrics done if they hadn't done that yet. And then the last step is how they will get moved from those different military bases, and they will get sent through one of the refugee resettlement organizations that will be on a list in your state. And so some of them will be Catholic Charities, the International Institute, World Relief, Lutheran Family Services, HIAS is another one. So there's a lot of great organizations that have the vehicle to bring folks and settle them into your area. If Tim wants to go to the next slide. So this is kind of a little bit of the numbers that have happened. And so there's about 64,000 evacuees, and then 53,000 of those are currently on US military bases. So going on to the next slide, what does that mean for us in terms of welcoming well? So these are a few of the lessons that I learned as I began to work with refugees directly, partnering with local churches in Northeast Ohio. The first one is that we need a lot of humility. It is overwhelming when people have to leave their country. It's actually overwhelming if you choose to leave your country, for those of us like myself who chose to live abroad for a short period or a long period. But when you get catapulted out in the way that some of our new Afghan neighbors have experienced, I would just say one of the things that I found is the best value is to take an extra dose in humility. So folks are going to be culture shocking. They're going to be sad. They might go through a whole range of emotions. A lot of folks, as I've talked to Afghan friends that I'm currently still trying to get over to the US, you know, they're grateful, but as you meet people and get to know them, they might not always be grateful every moment. Like they're going to go through the grief cycle. And so one of the things that we can be as safe neighbors and good friends is to allow people to go through the grief cycle. And that might mean sadness one day, it might mean anger, and that's okay because it's a hard thing what these folks have experienced. The second thing is to be a learner. And so while we want to let people process the grief and the hard things they've left, what they're missing, you'll probably have people, you know, compare Afghanistan to the US, and there's things that they feel like Afghanistan does better and they miss. It gives us this amazing opportunity to be a learner. And so over the last 6 or 7 years, as I've had Afghan friends and friends from other countries around the world, I've gotten to learn things about myself, about my culture, about their culture that have been so beautiful. They've reflected to me things that I didn't appreciate about my culture, that I got to see through new eyes, through my international friends, through my new American friends. But it also took me to the spot where I was able to learn things that are incredible about their culture. So I mentioned at the beginning of this, the Afghan people are some of the most hospitable, loyal people in the world. And watching how they show up for their friends and how they show up for their guests is incredible. And so that for me was a lesson that I really needed to learn from them. And then the next part is looking out for the needs of new arrivals above your own preferences. So one of the things that is tempting sometimes is to figure out and expect what people need, and to tell that, and to decide what folks need. I'd say one of the things I'd really encourage you is, as people have lost so much, including control, letting folks make their own decisions, encouraging them to make their own decisions, even if they want you to make decisions for them. It gives them a sense of autonomy, gives them a sense of, being able to own things themselves, which is really important in the healing process, as you've seen, they've had such a difficult launch. Next is, how do we get involved locally? So I mentioned how you can Google search and find an organization near you. So what that will look like in terms of getting involved. So I'm in Akron, Ohio. So I've Googled HHS plus refugee resettlement, and I found the map of Ohio, and I scrolled down and I found Akron. So the International Institute is my closest one. I do know them, so I'm going to give them as an example. But if I was brand new to this, the first thing I would do would be to fill out one of their volunteer forms. So every organization has different ones. Most of them, or maybe all, Matt can correct me later, have background checks involved, just to make sure that we are safe people working with folks who have been through so much. And then go through whatever necessary training those organizations have. So I know World Relief, they used to be in Akron. When I would work with them, they had a 2-hour training that everyone had to go through. Another a little aside, so that is directly how Afghans will end up in a city near you. But at the first line, I mentioned there's other local organizations that you might be able to serve and work with Afghans. And so some of those, they don't directly receive refugees or people who've come in on parole. But they are kind of secondary agencies that might have a DHS accreditation to do immigration work, like Building Hope in the City in Cleveland does. They could be local churches that are running English classes. So one of the things you could do is just to Google and ask questions and connect with your resettlement organization and find out, what is happening. And so it might be direct early when somebody first comes is the stage you want to get involved. But the other one could be you get involved in something that is a more long established program through a local nonprofit in your area that's not directly a refugee resettlement organization. And so they all have lots of opportunities. I'd say English is one of the biggest one, and being an English partner. I've underlined, be patient if they don't get back to you right away. Matt can confirm or deny this, but I'm pretty sure his local World Relief Office got 1,000 applications for volunteers the first month that Afghanistan fell. And so right now has gone from very, very few refugees coming the last few years and thinned out staff, places have had to close, to suddenly we are getting more new immigrants, more refugees in a short period of time than we have in the last 3 years combined. So if they are slow to get back to you, I would say just be patient. Give them time and space as they're, getting their infrastructure back up. Some of those organizations near you might be hiring. It might be worth, checking it out and seeing if they have employment opportunities that need filled. And then again, so not to overwhelm them, I'd say fill out their application form, get the background check done. Rather than just calling them and asking basic information, you might be able to just find things on a website or social media while you're waiting for their processing to be done for you. And so finding out if they need donations, Amazon cards, housing is going to be a huge need all over the country. And so one of the things is if you own an apartment or you own a house in an affordable area, does your house need rented out? Does your apartment need rented out? Or could you help connect with the agency to, look for housing? So that's one of the really big needs. And then moving on to the next one. So being a good partner involves listening. And so I would say one of the things that I saw done really well and sometimes done really poorly, it was always two extremes, is sometimes not listening. And so these organizations have a lot of training. They can walk you through the process. And so, asking them what they need in terms of volunteers. Now, with Tim's situation, his friend is going to come here for sure because he has a connection. So some of you, if you are really connected with an Afghan family or an individual that got brought to a military base, they might have a lot more say about where they go if they know you personally. And so in that case, you might be working with both your Afghan friend as well as the organization if they're a familiar person. And I'd say the same thing applies to listen well and to be guided by folks who have done this a little bit longer. So one of the ways that listening can go well or poorly. So donations are one of the really easy ways that people can think of to get involved. And I've been so encouraged in my area. I've seen these donation drives happening out of 4 corners of a suburb near me, where people are putting on Facebook, hey, give X, Y, and Z in order to welcome new Afghan families. It can also be one of the sticky areas if the resettlement organization doesn't have the space for it. And so it can be very overwhelming for them to have to resort things or figure out where to put the space if they don't have the storage space. So one thing that you could do is to make sure they have space for the new donations. If you are in a location in the country that you have a garage, one thing that you might want to be able to do is open your garage so that it can house some of this extra stuff for a time. And so that is one of the ways to be a servant in this. And then being a good partner is about reciprocal relationships, both with new Afghan immigrants as well as the resettlement organizations themselves. And so just looking for that moment to humble yourself, to be a learner, to know that you have as much to learn from the Afghan families that are going to join your community as they have to learn from you, if not more. And so, continue to practice that process of reciprocity. Be willing to receive things from people. Afghans are going to cook for you for the most part. Enjoyed their food and offered to cook them dinner as well. Afghan food is delicious. And then beyond resettlement, I mentioned some of those opportunities might be English classes, resettlement classes, resettlement citizenship classes. It's not just today or this month or the next 5 months that people are going to need your engagement, but the long haul. And so this can feel quite overwhelming sometimes. And so I'd say sometimes getting to know one family and becoming real friends with them, and then walking with them as they're adjusting to their new American life is really valuable, rather than spreading yourself super thin. Just to say, I know that there are questions coming in. I'm seeing a few of those. So as soon as I finish this, we'll make sure that the questions you have for both myself and Matt get answered. Thank you for asking those, and feel free to keep sending them in. And then the next slide, talks about our posture. And so this is one of my favorite verses from the book of Philippians. So the whole chapter is about Jesus coming as a servant leader. And in the middle of this, it says, rather in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. And that has just been, for me, such a thing that I can emulate after Jesus in all of my life, but specifically, as I'm welcoming folks who have lost so much and are moving to a new country, how do I honor them by putting them above myself? So one of the models, and again, I'd say look to your local resettlement agency to use their model. So if you're working with HIAS and it's different than this model, make sure you respond to the way they want to work. But one of the models that I've practiced is the World Relief model of resettlement. And one of the things I really like about it is it's so relational. So one of the ways World Relief mobilizes their volunteers is they put together something called a good neighbor team. And this, I was mentioning to Tim, that would work really well in Dayton with their new friends. And so when a new family moves country, there's so many needs, you probably won't even think of them all. I lived in the UK for a number of years and I spoke the language mostly. And the amount of things I didn't understand about moving to a new country that I had to have friends and colleagues and coworkers help me adjust to, whether it's the culture, things I shouldn't say because they're offensive over there and they're not offensive over here, understanding nuances to how you pay this tax or how you take care of this utility. There were so many things. And so for me, having people that I could communicate with who would help me adjust was really valuable. And that's basically what the World Relief model does in a formalized sense. And so they would have 6 to 10 people commit to a relationship with a particular refugee family for 6 months to a year. And if you are actually volunteering through World Relief, they give you a checklist. It's about a page long of all of these different things that need done in the first 6 weeks, month, 3 months of a new family's arrival. Set up their home, get registered for Social Security, register the children for school, open a checking account, etc. And there's a lot of appointments they need to go to. Now, some of these will be taken care of because of the way this group of Afghans had come through military bases, which is a little different than normal resettlement, like Matt said. But putting together a group of people, so it's not just one individual or one family having to meet all of these needs. And then I'd say, as you're helping your friend get on their feet and adjust to their new country, share loads of meals together. Afghans, for the most part, most of them, not all, but many of them the majority will be Muslim. And so look up halal meat and find out if there is a particular halal grocery store in the area or if your local grocery store carries halal food. And so that's the only thing I would say to just, that's a way to serve well, is invite them for food and buy halal chicken. And then receive their hospitality as well. And so here on the second slide, I've put a handful of the needs that come up with new immigrants that you could see there, and just kind of look through those. That's not exhaustive. Just know that there will be more, but it's a really good start. The cultural insider one, there's just so many things that we don't realize are special to us because we swim in the water that is the United States, but they will continue to come up for your friends. And so, being available and having a relational tie, I'd say that was probably one of the biggest things that my friends have appreciated over the years, is somebody who helped them adjust cross-culturally. So Matt said some of this on the next slide, so I'm not going to do this as much, but there's over 80 million globally displaced people. Almost a third of those are what's called refugees, so they've been displaced out. If refugees from Afghanistan don't come to your city, I would encourage you, if you're on this call, not to eliminate your opportunity to serve. So if you're here and you've got a particular heart for Afghans, I'm so grateful. But if it happens to be that your city isn't receiving them, there are so many other folks who have had equally terrible disasters, civil wars, ethnic cleansings, awful situations in their countries, religious persecution, political persecution, and they are coming to cities near you. And so if it's not somebody from Afghanistan, you might be able to volunteer and get involved with somebody from the Congo or from Iraq or somewhere else. As well, and it's different, but I'd say one thing we could be praying about, there's not the clear pathway with all the services involved through refugee resettlement that Afghans get, but there are violent gangs in Honduras. There's the collapse of Venezuela. There's what we're seeing happen in Haiti with multiple factors driving people out of the country. Asylum seekers are also vulnerable and don't have these kind of resources at their availability. And so, if you meet folks in your community who are being processed for asylum, and there's not Afghans, maybe that's something you want to get involved in. And many local churches are involved in the process of welcoming asylum seekers. Matt talked a little bit about advocacy. And so I know I got started a little late with my fiasco with the technology, so I won't say as much about this as I had planned. But with advocacy, I was told once that, we see what happens as the government is going to make their decisions and we'll just respond when they come. And I just disagree with that. So I would say a better way to engage with how we respond to refugees is, instead of looking at the government making their decisions, see it as an ongoing conversation with the government, an ongoing conversation with our elected officials. So when we see them do something great, we can encourage them. When we see something that needs to change, we want to ask them for provisions. And so in advocacy, it doesn't have to be partisan. And so a few of the advocacy things, the global displacement of people around the world has been significant. Refugee resettlement has declined significantly in our country in the last few years. Matt mentioned, we'll need some advocacy around what is the future of Afghans. So many of them have come in on what's called humanitarian parole. It is not as permanent as a normal special immigrant visa or an SIV, which was the normal way Afghans who partnered with our military were coming in. So they will need someone to help advocate for them as they apply for the next stage, whether it's if they qualify for an SIV, help them do that, or help them apply for asylum. But we do want to ask our government to create a sense of permanency, that this humanitarian parole will lead us towards something like green cards, and that they're not left in a kind of permanent state of limbo. And then lastly, I've got 3 different ways that you can get involved with that through either phone calls or signatures, just kind of reiterating what Matt said. So one of them is to ask that humanitarian parole have a permanent pathway toward green cards. And then the second one, for those of us who are still praying and acting, trying to get more folks out who are in danger, asking President Biden to allow more folks to be processed for SIV and humanitarian parole who are not part of the people on the military bases. And then lastly, there are folks in our country who have something called temporary protected status, and they have been in this kind of repetitive limbo for about 20 years from other conflicts and disasters they have fled. And so this can just help us shed light on other needs in the immigration system. And if you guys are interested in any of those, we'll make sure they all have a little bit of follow-up in the follow-up emails. So I'm going to switch us to the Q&A time. We were going to end at exactly 8:30. But since I had a little fiasco, I hope you will stay on for an extra 5 or 10 minutes while we field some of these questions.
Thank you so much, Christy.
Matt, join us as well.
Yeah, Matt can bring up his camera and microphone in a minute here. Hey, thanks, Matt. Welcome to the Q&A. Well, everybody, we are going to just take a few of these questions that have come in already, and then if anybody would like to ask additional questions, you can put them into the Q&A. There are a few there already, so we'll just go ahead and get started. I will suggest them, even though all of you can see them. I mean, all of us can see them here on our side. One person is asking, how can we find resources that help us better understand the cultures and customs of the people we're trying to help and serve, especially, I guess, Afghan people? Do you have any suggestions for that, Christy? I know you lived there for a little bit. What would you say to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are great books out there that I would say, I'll put a list of some books that have some good, I'm blanking on titles, actually. I'm terrible at remembering book titles, but I'll drop a couple books in the chat that, not in the chat, but in the email that we do follow up with. I'd say that would be the first one. The second one is actually, if you get to know Afghans, like asking them themselves. And so letting people tell you like what their customs are and what's important. And so I found sometimes it's really tempting to read a lot about people rather than learning from them. And so I know that's kind of harder and cheekier to say. You know, there's some general ones that you can learn that we could read through some books. And so I'd say like hospitality is a huge thing for Afghan culture. Loyalty is really big, like following through on your word, I think is a higher value in their culture than in ours. So I appreciate, you know, us even titling this Keep Our Word. That means a huge significant amount to Afghans. But I'd say, you know, as people get moved into your communities, asking them and learning from them and saying, hey, what's this like? How do you build friendship? You know, what's faith like in your community? How do parents and children relate to each other? Like what's important to you? Like those kind of broad questions, and then you can let people introduce you themselves.
Thanks a lot. That's great.
I just mentioned it real quick too. World Relief, I just checked, it's not up yet, but I know that we're working on an online course really to help volunteers understand Afghan cultural issues. So I put the link in just now in the chat. Whenever it's ready, that'll post there.
Great. Matt, can I also just ask the next question to you? If a church or a small group in a church was thinking, oh, we want to do something together to do this, let's say they go ahead and follow Christy's advice and they Google and they find out these organizations, and they find out, you know, they're going to find out a lot of information through that process. And they might be a little bit overwhelmed by that. You know, looking at it from the big picture, where would you recommend people put their effort? Or how do they kind of think about that? They could volunteer, they could give money, they could, you know, there's a lot to choose from.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so I wouldn't prescribe necessarily one way to respond. As Christy said, what we do at World Relief is called a Good Neighbor Team, which is sort of a pretty intensive group volunteering experience. It's often a small group. Again, we have that in all of our World Relief offices, but other resettlement agencies will, you know, may or may not have like a group volunteer set up, or maybe they'd work with you on setting that up. But it might be, you know, we don't have necessarily the time to do it right now, but we could help do a donation drive and help, you know, check in with the resettlement agencies and what the needs are right now. Our warehouse in the Chicagoland office where I usually work is full, which is fantastic, but we still have particular needs. Or it might be, you know, we're going to do a fundraiser. There's definitely a lot of financial needs for the resettlement agencies that with a lot of people coming in as well. And then again, advocacy as well is a huge need, both for those who are still stuck in Afghanistan and for those who are coming in, but not coming into the normal refugee process that would give them permanent legal status, which we're really concerned about.
Sure. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for that answer. So there's a question that came in here. Let's see. Someone's asking outside the US here, a person specifically who's in Bermuda. How would they, when they're not looking at the Googling what the US government has done, which is a great starting point, or Canada? I know we have people from Canada who are here. What would an international in another country do you think as a first step? Matt or Christy, whoever feels like they can jump on that one.
I mean, I'll say maybe Matt can say something better, but I don't know what every country in the world is doing in terms of Afghans. So I have no idea if Bermuda is welcoming them and resettling them. I mean, I would say I would start by checking that out, doing that Google search for your own country, finding out, is that happening? Most countries will make that information available. So I know, for example, the UK has resettled Afghans that were serving with their military, and they're bringing them in. I know that that there's about 100 folks in Hungary right now who are semi-connected to Hungary and the US. And so I would just do those searches, and every country is different. And so, yeah, figuring that out. Matt, do you have other suggestions?
No, it's going to vary country to country. And I would say, I mean, Canada was mentioned. Canada certainly is receiving Afghans. And in the last several years, Canada has received more refugees overall than the United States, even with roughly a tenth of our population. So it's a very robust resettlement process in Canada. Even if it's, I would be surprised maybe if Afghans were being resettled to Bermuda, but would also be surprised if no one was reaching Bermuda from another country. Refugee and immigration issues are an issue in every country in the world. So, I mean, it's going to look different from one country to another in terms of what the legal, protocols are, but there are always opportunities to show kindness to vulnerable foreigners.
I am not muted anymore. So I'm going to answer a question myself that came in here. There was someone asking if we can sponsor Afghans who are coming to the U.S. And you didn't mention this, Christy or Matt, but maybe it would come up if people followed some of the links. We know that there are needs for people to sponsor Afghans who are trying to enter the immigration process. And some of the costs related to the application process. So we do know of a lawyer doing pro bono work in the Chicago area who's asking for help in that area. And I'll put some information about that into our follow-up information that we share. But there definitely are ways you could just sponsor Afghans seeking to come out of Afghanistan and into the US as well. Yeah, I think that's about it from the questions. So thank you so much for participating. Did you have any other questions you thought maybe should be asked, Matt or Christy, that didn't come to the Q&A that you want to bring in, ask and answer?
Do you want to say that one, Matt, about sponsorship and say a little more about that?
Yeah, just so there's a little clarity. I think probably what people are hearing about with sponsorship is something called humanitarian parole. So it's possible to request humanitarian parole. The humanitarian parole is a completely discretionary process, so we don't know yet how the U.S. government, that is to say, is going to respond to humanitarian parole requests. We've seen that they have approved some, primarily for people who had another immigrant visa option that was just going to take more time, like a special immigrant visa or a family sponsorship. In some cases, they do ask for basically evidence that the individual seeking humanitarian parole is not going to be a burden economically on the United States. That's where there is a form called 9134 that sometimes people need help having completed. So that's something an attorney can help with. But I do think it's important to understand too, it's not sponsorship in that there's no guarantee that if you fill out that form that family is going to be allowed to come. It would make it perhaps more likely that they might be granted humanitarian parole. I would also say I saw a question in the Q&A around the statement I made around refugees and terrorism. I think it is important to understand when someone's resettled as a refugee, that's a distinct legal process. That's someone who's come at the invitation of the United States. So there's a question about what about someone who's come unlawfully in the United States? That person is by definition not a refugee. Although it's also worth noting that among people who have entered the United States unlawfully, none of them have taken the life of an American citizen in a terrorist attack either. And there's a report I will put in the chat there so people can go do their homework on sort of terrorism and mode of entry and nationality for those situations.
Thanks so much. I'll wrap up. If you guys want to drop your video away, I'll take over as the only head talking here and bring this home. Thanks a lot so much, Matt and Christy, for coming. This ends our question and answer session, and now we are at the end of our virtual workshop. Yay! So let me just offer a few words in conclusion. Later tonight, we're going to send out a short document summarizing what was discussed tonight, along with links to resources. And in addition, we'll mention some of these things about sponsoring Afghan parolee applications as well there and highlight that. We'd love to stay in touch with you and hear about how you're working to help Afghans in your communities and share more about opportunities to help and what we all learn about during the process. To that end, we've created a private Facebook group called Keep Our Word to Afghan Refugees. We'll also include a link to that in the document we send tonight. Feel free to join the group and share what you're doing and collaborate with others there. Thank you for coming and have a good night. Goodbye.